billionaire's baby cried nonstop in the restaurant until the waitress's 12-year-old black daughter did the unthinkable. "This child is ruining my business dinner," shouted William Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries, with his 6-month-old baby bawling in his arms as all the customers at the upscale Grand View restaurant turned to stare. "Where's the manager? I need a solution now." Little Emma Sterling had been crying for 40 minutes straight, turning what should have been an 8,000 dinner with Japanese investors into a living nightmare. William had tried everything: expensive bottles, imported toys, even offering money for other tables to move. Nothing worked. "Mr. Sterling, we've already called 3 emergency babysitters," whispered the maître nervously, "but none of them have been able to calm her down." At the investors' table, diplomatic smiles were beginning to turn into expressions of barely concealed irritation. This was the $50 million deal that would secure Sterling Industries' expansion into Asia. That's when Linda Thompson, a 34-year-old waitress who had been working at Grand View for 6 years, approached discreetly. "Mr. Sterling, I could try." "You?" William interrupted her with a cruel laugh, looking up and down at the black woman in her simple uniform. "Please, I've already paid for professional experts. I don't need amateur advice." Linda backed away but didn't leave completely. She had seen situations like this before. Her 12-year-old daughter, Victoria, was finishing her homework at a table in the back of the restaurant. It was the weekend, and the babysitter had called in sick at the last minute. "What's so special about this kid?" one of the investors muttered in Japanese, clearly losing his patience. William was desperate. His $2 billion empire had started with Asian investments, and this deal could double his net worth. But Emma continued to scream as if her life depended on it. "Linda," he called again, now without his previous arrogance. "You said you could try." "Actually, sir," Linda replied with impressive calm, "the one who really understands babies here is my daughter, Victoria. She has a special gift with small children." William looked in the direction Linda was pointing and saw a 12-year-old black girl sitting alone, surrounded by advanced math books and a used laptop. His eyes narrowed with contempt. "Are you suggesting that I hand my daughter over to a child who shouldn't even be here during working hours?" William, the restaurant manager, interjected discreetly. Perhaps it would be better to try anything at this point. The humiliation was public and deliberate. William raised his voice so that half the restaurant could hear him. "Fine. Bring on this junior consultant. But when it doesn't work out, I want both of you out of here immediately and never to return. And Linda, consider your job under review." Victoria Thompson slowly rose from her table, carefully closing a differential calculus book, a subject that college students found challenging. At 12, she was officially a math prodigy, but few people knew that. As she walked toward William's table, her eyes picked up details that the adults had overlooked. The uncomfortable position in which William was holding Emma, the temperature of the restaurant, the noise of the cutlery that was overwhelming the baby's senses. "May I?" she asked simply, extending her arms. William handed Emma over with an expression of utter skepticism. "5 minutes after that, you two are out of my sight." What happened next defied all expectations. Victoria adjusted Emma into a specific position, applied light pressure to the correct points on the baby's back, and began humming a soft melody she had learned from her grandmother. In less than 30 seconds, the crying stopped completely. The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Emma opened her eyes, focused on Victoria's face, and for the first time in hours smiled. Not only had she stopped crying, she was visibly relaxed and happy. How did you do that?" William stammered, looking at the 12-year-old girl who had achieved what professional nannies and experts had failed to do. Victoria handed Emma back to William, maintaining the same position that had worked. She just needed someone to really pay attention to what was bothering her. Mr. Sterling, the Japanese investors began chatting excitedly among themselves, clearly impressed. Dinner could continue. The deal was still on. But something in Victoria's gaze made William feel inexplicably uncomfortable. It was a look too mature for her 12 years, as if she were studying him in the same meticulous way she had analyzed the baby's needs. When Linda approached to take Victoria back to her table, William felt compelled to ask a question. What were you studying there?" "Game theory applied to behavioral economics," Victoria replied casually. "I'm analyzing how irrational decisions by powerful people can create predictable mathematical opportunities for others." William blinked, not fully understanding the answer, but sensing that there was something much more complex going on there than a simple child calming a baby. As Victoria returned to her books, she couldn't help but smile slightly. She had just witnessed firsthand the very kind of arrogance and prejudice she studied in her theories. And if you're enjoying this story of how a 12-year-old girl did what experts couldn't, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened after that night would completely change the lives of everyone involved. Especially William Sterling, who didn't yet know that he had just underestimated the wrong person. After all, what that arrogant billionaire didn't know was that Victoria Thompson wasn't just a child prodigy in mathematics. She was someone who had spent years observing, analyzing, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to prove that real intelligence has nothing to do with money or skin color. The next day, Linda arrived at work at Grand View and found a completely different atmosphere. The other employees looked at her with a mixture of pity and discomfort, while manager James Morrison called her in for a private conversation. "Linda, about what happened last night?" He began avoiding eye contact. "Mr. Sterling called this morning. He was not pleased with the episode involving your daughter." "Episode?" Linda repeated, feeling her blood boil. "You mean when my daughter solved a problem that professional nannies charging $1,000 an hour couldn't solve?" James sighed uncomfortably. He said it was inappropriate to bring a child into the workplace, especially during an important business dinner, and that you acted outside of protocol by allowing a minor to interfere with customers. Interfere? Linda laughed bitterly. Victoria saved his dinner. "Linda, you know how it works here. Clients like William Sterling bring in tens of thousands a month. He specifically requested that Victoria no longer appear in the restaurant during her working hours." The humiliation burned in Linda's chest like acid. In 6 years working at Grand View, she had been a model employee. She arrived early, stayed late, covered shifts for sick coworkers, and now she was being punished because her brilliant daughter had demonstrated abilities that embarrassed a spoiled billionaire. "What if I don't agree?" Linda asked, already knowing the answer. James lowered his voice even further. He mentioned that he is considering moving his corporate events to another establishment. "That's over $200,000 a year in revenue, Linda. The owner can't afford to lose that client." Meanwhile, Victoria was at the public library where she spent every morning before school. But today, instead of focusing on advanced math books, she was doing something different, researching. "Sterling Industries, William Sterling," she muttered to herself, typing on the library's old computer. Within minutes, she had access to public information about the company, financial reports, press releases, court proceedings. What she found made her eyes widen with growing interest. Sterling Industries had been sued 5 times in the last 3 years for questionable labor practices, mass layoffs during the pandemic, benefit cuts, psychological pressure on employees. And in every case, William had used his expensive lawyers to avoid real consequences. "Interesting behavioral pattern," Victoria whispered, jotting it down in her notebook. It was exactly the kind of data she studied in her analyses of how powerful people abuse systems to avoid responsibility. At school, things weren't any better. Her math teacher, Ms. Chun, had noticed Victoria's gloomy mood during class. "Victoria, you seem distracted today. Is there a problem with the math exercises?" "No, teacher. Actually, I was thinking about game theory applied to situations of asymmetric power." Ms. Chin blinked, momentarily confused. Even though she was an advanced math teacher, she sometimes forgot that she was dealing with a child who had already mastered college-level concepts. Asymmetric power situations. When one person has disproportionate resources and uses that advantage to intimidate or control others, Victoria explained with a calmness that did not reflect the storm in her mind. "I'm analyzing how these dynamics can be mathematically predicted and corrected." During lunch, Victoria sat alone as usual. But today was different. She wasn't reading. She was observing, studying her classmates' behavior patterns, analyzing how social hierarchies formed and maintained themselves through small acts of inclusion and exclusion. "It's all about information and timing," she muttered to herself, scribbling equations on her napkin. Power is just information applied at the right moment. When she got home in the afternoon, she found her mother sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing her restaurant uniform, looking defeated. "Mom, did something happen?" Linda looked at her daughter. "Mom, did something happen?" Linda looked at her daughter. This 12-year-old who spoke like an adult and thought like a scientist, and felt her heart tighten. How could she explain that the world was unfair to exceptional people like Victoria? "Mr. Sterling didn't like what happened yesterday," Linda said carefully. "He asked you not to come to the restaurant during my shifts anymore." Victoria was silent for a long moment, processing the information. When she finally spoke, her voice was colder than Linda had ever heard it. He felt threatened. Victoria, no, Mom, that's exactly it. He felt threatened because a 12-year-old black girl solved a problem he couldn't solve with all his money and power. And now he's using his economic influence to punish our family. Linda saw something in Victoria's eyes that frightened her a little. It was an intensity that seemed far too mature for a 12-year-old. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course, dear. Did you know that Sterling Industries has been sued 5 times for abusive labor practices, and that William Sterling personally laid off 300 employees during the pandemic to keep his executive bonuses? Linda looked at her daughter in surprise. How do you know that? Research, Victoria replied simply. It's all public information, just like the fact that he owes $2 million in back taxes and is being investigated for tax evasion. Victoria, where are you going with this? Victoria slowly closed her notebook, but not before Linda saw pages covered with numbers, graphs, and what looked like complex equations mixed with news clippings. People like William Sterling commit injustices because they believe there will be no consequences, Victoria said with a serenity that sent shivers down Linda's spine. They count on the fact that their victims don't have the resources to fight back. Victoria, you're scaring me a little. There's no need to be afraid, Mom. I'm just studying patterns. Victoria smiled, but it was a different smile. Calculated. You know, there's a mathematical theory called Nash equilibrium. Basically, it predicts that in any strategic game, eventually all players will find a strategy where no one can unilaterally improve their position. Linda didn't fully understand what her daughter was saying, but something in the way Victoria said it made her stomach clench. The problem, Victoria continued, is that William Sterling thinks he's playing a game where he has all the advantages. He doesn't realize that he changed the rules by putting me in the equation. That night, while Linda slept, Victoria stayed up late on her computer borrowed from school. She wasn't doing homework. She was doing something much more complex. Mapping William Sterling's financial, social, and professional structure with the precision of a mathematician and the patience of someone who learned at a very young age that underestimated people always have a crucial advantage. They are invisible until the exact moment they decide not to be anymore. And as Victoria worked on her calculations, something began to take shape in her mind. Not exactly a plan for revenge, but something more sophisticated. An equation where William Sterling's arrogance would become the variable that would destroy his own result. Because if there's one thing mathematical prodigies learn early on, it's that every system, no matter how powerful it seems, has points of vulnerability. And Victoria Thompson had just identified exactly where William Sterling was most vulnerable. His own unshakable belief that a 12-year-old black girl could never pose a real threat to his perfectly controlled world. What that arrogant billionaire didn't yet know was that he had just challenged someone who saw problems where others saw impossibilities. She saw just another equation waiting to be solved in the most elegant and devastating way possible. 3 weeks after the incident at the restaurant, Victoria was where she always was in her most crucial moments at the public library. But this time she wasn't alone. At her side, Professor David Kim, a retired mathematician from the local university, looked impressed at the calculations Victoria had developed. Victoria, this is graduate-level work, said Professor Kim, adjusting his glasses as he analyzed the complex equations she had scribbled on dozens of sheets of paper. Have you really developed a mathematical model to predict corporate behavior patterns? Not exactly predict, Professor, Victoria replied with that disconcerting calm. It's more like identifying systemic vulnerabilities in power structures based on arrogance and prejudice. Professor Kim had met Victoria 6 months earlier when she showed up at his lecture on game theory in the library. A 12-year-old girl asking questions that doctors couldn't formulate had immediately caught his attention. Show me again how you arrived at these numbers on Sterling Industries, he asked, genuinely fascinated. Victoria opened a folder organized with military precision. Analysis of public financial reports from the last 5 years, cross-referenced with labor lawsuits, mass layoff patterns, and executive social media behavior. William Sterling follows an almost perfect mathematical pattern. What kind of pattern? He makes the same errors in judgment every 18 months, always underestimating people he considers inferior. And he always documents these decisions in a way that can be traced. Meanwhile, at the Sterling Industries office, William had completely forgotten about the incident with the waitress and the annoying child. He was focused on something much more important, the biggest deal of his career. Mr. Sterling, said his assistant, the Yamamoto Corporation delegation will arrive next week to finalize the merger agreement. They insisted on dining at the Grand View again. William smiled with satisfaction. Perfect. That place knows its audience. No unnecessary interference this time. What William didn't know was that his own arrogance had created an opportunity that Victoria was methodically exploiting. Through her research, she had discovered something fascinating. Yamamoto Corporation had extremely strict corporate values regarding social responsibility and ethical behavior. "Professor Kim," Victoria said, showing him a new set of calculations. "I need your help with something." "Of course, Victoria. What do you have in mind?" "How would you go about ensuring that specific information reached the right people at the exact moment it would have the most impact?" Professor Kim stopped writing and looked at Victoria with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Victoria, that sounds like you're planning something very elaborate." "I'm just applying game theory to a real-life situation, Professor. If someone uses power and prejudice as strategies for domination, it creates predictable mathematical vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who understand the rules of the game." Over the next 2 weeks, strange things began to happen in William Sterling's life. Small things that he initially ignored. First, an investigative journalist began asking specific questions about Sterling Industries' labor practices. William dismissed this as just another leftist trying to cause trouble. Then his LinkedIn account began receiving comments from former employees sharing their experiences working at the company. His public relations department said it was just disgruntled former employees. Then something more serious. The IRS announced a surprise audit of his companies, focusing specifically on the years that Victoria had identified as most problematic in her analysis. "It's a coincidence," William told his accountant. "These audits happen randomly." In the library, Victoria showed Professor Kim a series of newspaper articles and social media posts that had appeared over the past week. "How did you orchestrate all this?" asked Professor Kim, impressed. "I didn't orchestrate anything," Victoria replied honestly. "I just identified the right pressure points and provided factual information to the right people." The system regulated itself. "What kind of information?" Victoria opened a digital folder on her borrowed laptop. "Remember I told you that William Sterling documents his own failures? Well, he has a habit of recording executive meetings and making problematic comments about employees, all archived on corporate servers with questionable security." Professor Kim gulped. "Victoria, how did you gain access to that?" "I didn't gain access to anything, Professor. But there's such a thing as anonymous reporting, and when you provide the appropriate authorities with the exact location of information, they have a legal right to investigate." That night, William Sterling received a call that completely robbed him of his sleep. His corporate lawyer was visibly nervous. "William, we need to talk urgently. The audit found some irregularities, and there's something else that's more worrying." "What now?" "Yamamoto Corporation is reconsidering the merger agreement. They received an anonymous dossier with information about the company's labor practices. They want a meeting to clarify some concerns before finalizing any deal." William felt his blood run cold. The deal with Yamamoto was worth $400 million and represented the international expansion he had been planning for 5 years. "What kind of information?" "Audio recordings of executive meetings where you make, let's say, culturally insensitive comments about employees and documents showing dismissals targeting specific groups." The next day, Victoria was at Grand View with her mother, who had managed to keep her job only because the manager had interceded on her behalf. Linda was still unaware of the events unfolding in William Sterling's life. "Honey, you've been very quiet lately," Linda commented as they organized the utensils for the night shift. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, Mom. I'm just observing some interesting patterns manifesting." Themselves. Linda looked at her daughter curiously. But before she could ask any more questions, the manager approached with a tense expression. "Linda, I need to warn you. Mr. Sterling has made a reservation for tonight. A very important meeting with Japanese investors. He specifically requested that his daughter not be present in their restaurant." Victoria smiled in that way that always made Linda slightly uncomfortable. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll stay at the library until you finish your shift." What neither of them knew was that Victoria had other plans. The library closed at 9 a.m. exactly when William Sterling's crucial meeting would be taking place at the Grand View. At 8:30 p.m., Victoria sent a message from a payphone to a number she had found in the Yamamoto Corporation's corporate records. "If you want to truly understand who you are doing business with, I suggest you observe how Mr. Sterling treats people he considers inferior. You will be dining at the Grand View tonight at 9 p.m. A demonstration is worth 1,000 reports." As William Sterling prepared for the most important dinner of his career, adjusting his tie and reviewing the deal documents, He had no idea that a 12-year-old girl had turned his arrogance into a perfect mathematical trap. Victoria closed her notebook and smiled. Phase 1 of what she called Project Balance was complete. All the variables were aligned. All the elements were in place. Now all that remained was to watch William Sterling do exactly what his behavioral patterns predicted he would do when he felt pressured. Triple his arrogance and prejudice, especially against people he couldn't control. The difference was that this time the right people would be watching and recording and making decisions that would change everything. What William Sterling didn't know was that he was about to discover that underestimating a 12-year-old black girl would be the most costly mistake of his entire billionaire life. And that Victoria Thompson wasn't just solving a mathematical equation. She was completely rewriting the rules of the game that people like him thought they controlled. Because if there's one thing mathematical prodigies know how to do better than anyone else, it's turning their opponent's arrogance into the very tool of their destruction. At 9 that night, William Sterling adjusted his tie for the third time as he waited for the Yamamoto Corporation delegation at the Grand View. The $400 million deal was just a few signatures away. "Mr. Yamamoto, it's a pleasure to welcome you back," William said, shaking the Japanese CEO's hand. What he didn't notice were the 3 discreet men sitting at nearby tables, each with virtually invisible recording equipment. "Mr. Sterling," Yamamoto replied politely, but his expression was more serious than usual. "Before we proceed, we have some concerns we would like to clarify." William laughed confidently. "Of course, ask anything you like." Just then, Linda approached the table carrying the tray of drinks. William recognized her immediately and felt a familiar irritation. "You still work here?" William asked, his voice laden with disdain. "I thought we had already made it clear that people like you should know their place." The silence at the Japanese table was instantaneous. Yamamoto exchanged meaningful glances with his colleagues. "And where is that annoying daughter of yours?" William continued, now speaking loudly enough for other tables to hear. "That black child who thinks she's so smart. I guarantee she no longer bothers our important customers." William Yamamoto interrupted gently. "May I ask how you usually treat your employees?" With necessary firmness, William replied without hesitation. "Especially when they are people who don't understand natural hierarchies. It's important to maintain certain standards in quality establishments." Linda continued serving in silence, but her eyes briefly met Yamamoto's, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Interesting perspective," Yamamoto murmured, taking notes on his tablet. "And these natural hierarchies, are they applied in your company as well?" William, misinterpreting the interest, smiled expansively. "Of course, it's fundamental to efficiency. Each person in their proper place, each group with its natural limitations. That's how you build a $2 billion empire." The Japanese continued to ask seemingly innocent questions, and William, convinced he was impressing them with his strong leadership, increasingly revealed his true prejudices. Across the restaurant, Victoria watched everything through the window of the library opposite the Grand View. In her hands, a borrowed cell phone vibrated constantly with notifications. The recordings were already being streamed live to Yamamoto Corporation's official social media accounts. "Perfect timing," Victoria muttered, checking the numbers. 3,000 views and counting. Inside the restaurant, William's phone began to ring incessantly. First his press secretary, then his lawyer, then his accountant. "Excuse me?" William said to the Japanese, answering the call from his public relations director. "William, you need to get out of there now. Your statements are going viral on social media. The Dreer Sterling racist is trending." William paused, looking at the Japanese, who were now watching him with withering expressions. "Mr. Yamamoto," he began. "Mr. Sterling." Yamamoto interrupted him, rising calmly. "Yamamoto Corporation has very clear values regarding diversity and human respect. We consider this agreement definitively terminated." "Wait, I can explain. This was a misunderstanding." But the Japanese were already leaving, followed by the stares of the entire restaurant that had witnessed the public humiliation. William's phone rang again. It was the chairman of Sterling Industries. "William, you're fired. The board is meeting tomorrow to choose your replacement. Security is already on its way to your home to collect company equipment." As William slumped in his chair, Linda approached to collect the empty glasses. "You know, Mr. Sterling," she said calmly, "my daughter Victoria has an interesting theory about people like you. She says that arrogance is just ignorance disguised as power." William looked at her with growing horror. "It was you like a 12-year-old. "Victoria isn't just any child," Linda replied with a smile that mixed maternal pride and absolute satisfaction. She's someone who understands that true intelligence lies in letting people reveal exactly who they are when they feel secure in their own superiority. As William Sterling watched his $2 billion empire crumble in real time through notifications on his cell phone, a mathematical truth began to form in his stunned mind. He had been calculatedly destroyed by a 12-year-old girl who had turned his own arrogance into the most lethal weapon possible. But Victoria's revenge was just beginning, because if there's one thing mathematical prodigies know how to do better than solve equations, it's ensuring that every negative variable is completely eliminated from the system. 6 months later, Victoria Thompson was where she had always dreamed of being in the MIT office, signing her acceptance letter for the Special Applied Mathematics program with a full scholarship. At 13, she would be the youngest student in the university's history. "Your letter of recommendation from Yamamoto Corporation was exceptional," said the director of admissions. "They mentioned that you demonstrated practical application of mathematical theory in social contexts with measurable results." Victoria smiled. Yamamoto had not only canceled the agreement with Sterling, but also created a scholarship fund in her name for young prodigies from underprivileged communities. Meanwhile, William Sterling was living his new reality in a 2-bedroom apartment, working as a freelance consultant after no reputable company agreed to hire him. The video office racist statements have been viewed by 12 million people, becoming a case study in business schools on how to destroy a career in one conversation. Linda now managed 3 Yamamoto chain restaurants in the United States after the Japanese corporation hired her as Director of Human Resources. Impressed by her dignity during the public humiliation ID from the beginning that this would happen, Linda asked her daughter as they visited the MIT campus. "I didn't know," Victoria replied honestly, "but I calculated the probability. People like William Sterling always reveal who they really are when they feel superior. I just created the perfect environment for that to happen in front of the right people." On the last day of school before moving to Boston, Victoria found a letter in her locker. It was from an 8-year-old student at the local elementary school. "Thank you for showing me that being smart is not something we should hide." Victoria folded the letter carefully. That girl had understood the real lesson. It wasn't about revenge, but about proving that genuine intelligence always finds a way. The following week, William Sterling saw a news story that made him choke on his coffee. 13-year-old prodigy develops algorithm that prevents discrimination in selection processes. The photo showed Victoria receiving an award for social innovation. The final irony, the algorithm was being implemented in companies around the world, including several that were former suppliers to Sterling Industries. Victoria Thompson had turned a billionaire's arrogance into the tool of her own rise. She proved that true revenge is not destroying those who harm you. It is building something so brilliant that it renders all the pettiness they try to use against you irrelevant. Mathematics had spoken. Prejudice is just ignorance disguised as power, and real intelligence always finds an equation to win. If this story of how a 12-year-old girl rewrote the rules of the game has inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that underestimating someone because of their age, color, or background is always the first step toward defeat. Because at the end of the day, brilliant people don't need to diminish anyone else to shine.